Hi, my name is Jennifer Howell. I am talking about a literature review, gender segregated intimate partner violence programs, and questioning the paradigm in which they have existed. Basically, my question was whether or not intimate partner violence is gendered and whether or not gender segregated programs are as effective. In order to do that, I first did some research into the previous thoughts and how we got to where we're at. Um, Originally, law enforcement saw it as an interpersonal issue and not a criminal issue, and was something that just needed to be handled between the family. However, there were more and more homicides, particularly in domestic violence situations, and in the 1970s, based on the feminism as it was developing at the time, the belief was that patriarchy in our society was perpetuating the issue, and that domestic violence was more a way to oppress women. And that if a woman were to respond violently, it would be in self-defense, and not as perpetration. And as a result, based on those beliefs, the Duluth model was developed, which we'll talk about later, to help treat these individuals. Um, so the past research was mainly focused on protecting the vulnerable population of women who could be isolated or removed from resources that would help them to extricate themselves from a violent situation, and was mostly focused on preventing homicide. And so the research was based off of that patriarchal belief system. And in Duluth, Minnesota, there was extensive research happening, and the big push was to organize the agencies that interacted with domestic violence, like law enforcement, the legal system, medical health professionals, that kind of stuff. And all of that was, again, based off of the patriarchal understanding of domestic violence. And it did show a 50% success rate. So at the time, since that was really one of the only options, it seemed the most successful. As time progressed, law enforcement began to express some frustration at the situation. They're typically the first responders in domestic violence situations, and so it was pretty well understood that domestic violence calls were very unpredictable and unsafe, and law enforcement was restricted in their ability to decide on who on arresting. They needed to have quite a bit of evidence in order to do so, and as a result, houses where they knew domestic violence was occurring had a high rate of homicide. And so laws were changed in order to give them more discretionary power, and that was in the form of mandatory and pro-arrest states, which became pretty popular at the time. And so as a result of those changes, they began to see some differences in those who were arrested. For instance, like in homosexual relationships with lesbians, there were two women, one a perpetrator and one a victim, and so it began to draw into question the patriarchal construct. And then also the law enforcement would run into bilateral situations where both were perpetuating the violence. And that was conflicting for law enforcement because they were actively encouraged and trained not to arrest women as perpetrators. And so oftentimes they would arrest both parties in order to let the courts decide on who was the perpetrator. And when it came to prosecuting female perpetrators, male perpetrators used to claim that they were reacting in self-defense, and so the courts focused more on intent, whether or not the individual had intended to harm their partner, and so women were held to the same basic standard as a result. Um, so it drew into question, were women really abusing? And because more and more women were brought into the system, there was this question of if they were arresting victims. So there was, again, a call for more research. And so looking at whether or not law enforcement was arresting both people in order to avoid political backlash of just arresting the female perpetrators, it seemed that in at least 50% of the cases, both were being arrested. Men are known to underreport when they're receiving domestic violence, and male victims are 3 times more likely to be arrested. On top of that, law enforcement being encouraged not to arrest women, and then that women are more likely to be cited than arrested, indicated that with women still being arrested and in the numbers that they were indeed perpetuating domestic violence. And then, so the question became, what were the reasons for abusing? And there were several studies that looked at that. The main reasons, and this was pretty consistent across both genders, was negative emotions, communication issues, retaliation, and self-defense. And so it seemed as though it was more of a gendered issue, or that it was a psychological issue, not a gender issue. So understanding that as a basis, the next question was, what is the best way to treat these individuals? And so there was some research that looked at the Duluth model and the ways to best facilitate that program. Some of those things were to have 2 facilitators, to have small group sizes, to have a 52-week minimum for treatment programs in order to work through interpersonal issues that might come up, to do a combination of group and individual, and then also to have a lesson plan that focused on challenging pro-violence thinking and was more of a therapeutic setting construct. So the problem with the Duluth model in the group setting was that there's still a 50% failure rate, and those who drop out of the program were 6 times more likely to reoffend than those, obviously, who graduated. The Duluth model has been scrutinized for potential shaming, and the evidence shows that a majority of the people or a large population of offenders have family of origin trauma, and so shaming can be counterproductive in those situations. And because it's based on patriarchy, it's very limited in its applicability, even though it was focusing a lot on the behavior, but it didn't necessarily address the psychological things going on underneath. So in my research, I came across a lot of research done by John Hamill, and he created or wrote a book about gender inclusive programs based on what he'd been seeing with the individuals he'd been working with, and began to develop a way of standardizing treating domestic violence offenders, both male and female. And in his approach, he basically stated that there's no one theory that clearly illustrates what goes on, and so there's a combination of family systems theory, psychology, cognitive behavioral therapy, and feminism that helps to explain what's going on internally for these individuals. So in his approach, when he educates facilitators, he focuses first on stopping the violence by challenging the cognition and analyzing the reinforcers, and encouraging like self-monitoring and problem solving, and then introduces skills like pro-social behavior, egalitarianism, working through conflict, self-awareness, so that they can turn inward and understand what's happening on an emotional level and why. Um, and then empathy, which has been shown in several studies to help counteract violence and anger. And then, of course, anger management, communication skills and conflict resolution, all things to help with the interpersonal issues, communication. And then finally, after that, to address the trauma. And he seemed to find pretty significant success rates in that. So overall, the indicators are that women and men do perpetuate domestic violence equally and for the same reasons. And so introducing a treatment program that addresses the underlying issues, that is standardized, has the potential to save money and resources, to have the most effect on a greater population. And that is it. Have a good evening.